Amen. Thanks, Patrick. I thought you did pretty good. I don't know about you guys, but we're blessed to have people like the Hennigans here. Just such sweet spirits. So obviously display the fruit of the Spirit. And okay, I'm going to stop making your head big over there. You did a good job, okay? I just want to start out by saying that I'm glad to be here with you this morning. It's always a pleasure to me. I didn't grow up in church. I didn't start going to church until I was about 13, so I don't have these, deep connections to a lot of these old songs, but they're still very rich to me, and it's a pleasure every time I get to be with you in this service. Both my grandfathers fought in Vietnam, and I play disc golf pretty often, and I'm pretty good. It's funny, it's maybe it's not a coincidence that I'm talking about this, but I competed in a veterans memorial tournament. There was 96 people there, some 44 teams or 40, whatever that math works out to be. It was a doubles tournament. Me and my partner won like the whole thing. So, but it was a veterans memorial thing. So it's funny that we're talking about that. But the point is that I play and there's a lot of people, that are young that play, and there's actually some guys that are in their 50s and 60s that play, but I don't know why, but it just happens to be that there's a lot of veterans that play, and so my point is, I have grandparents and friends that are serving now that have served, that aren't serving anymore because they're disabled. There's a guy that I play with pretty often. He's probably 40, and he had a pretty bad injury to his knee, and so he hobbles around across the course, but he plays. But I just want to say that I'm just so grateful to every man and woman who would put their self in my place. The word says that there's no greater love than to lay down your life for another man, and I think wholeheartedly, whether you're doing that for your country or for the Lord, or just for whatever reason, if you put yourself in harm's way for another man or another woman, it's a beautiful reflection of God's love to us. So I'm very, very grateful for all of you in here who have done that. I want to go straight into, because I'm going to try to get through all of this morning, Genesis chapter 1, or starting at the beginning. I want to read a couple verses out of here, and I want to dive right in. Genesis chapter 1. Verse 26 through 27. I think it's going to be up here. That's the NIV version, which whenever I was in college and we were studying different translations, we would call that one the nearly inspired version. And I'm going to be reading out of the ESV, which is the extra spiritual version. So try to keep up. It says this in verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Verse 27. So God created man in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. That's a pretty crazy statement. We're created in the image of God. I remember thinking about this as a teenager and thinking like, okay, does that mean that God looks like me? Whenever we're young, and maybe even whenever into our adulthood, we can think of this in just such a finite matter. We think of like God's form, but then we read other verses like, who has seen the face of God? Who knows what God looks like? So it's maybe it's talking about something more than just physical appearance, and I think we know for sure that it definitely is. But I think of these sayings, whenever we have children, we're like, man, that girl is a spitting image of her mother, right? We're talking about just the physical look. They look not exactly like, but obviously they are closely related, and this child comes from this adult, right? We're talking about something completely physical, though. And I don't think that's necessarily what he's trying to say here. So let's take it a step farther. So there's another saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But that one, we're not talking about image. We're talking about like characteristics, like personhood, like this father is bent towards this type of thing, and it's no surprise that his son is that way too. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? And I've heard people, say things in my life that have made me cringe, and well, my father was an alcoholic, so I'm an alcoholic. My father was prone to be angry, so I'm angry. Or my mother was this way, and so I'm that way, and those type of things. And I minored in psychology, so I'm definitely not a psychologist, but I have 21 hours of psychology. And what I can tell you is that I'm a behaviorist. I believe that behavior is learned. I don't think we have to be taught how to sin, but the vices in which we sin that are more sophisticated in nature, those are taught to us. And I can tell you this, I'm nothing like my real dad. My real dad was abusive to my mom. My real dad was a drug addict. He's, by world standards, he's a loser. He lives in Shreveport, and I still have never met him. He's never tried to reach out to me. Now my stepdad, on the other hand, there's a lot about me that's like him. And my mom, it was just me and my mom for almost 11 years, so a lot of me is her, right? Her characteristic, her traits, they were passed down to me. I wasn't born with them. They passed them on to me. And I'm grateful for that. The point I'm getting at, though, is whenever this says that we're made in God's image, it's not talking about some traits that we picked up along the way, and it's not talking about some physical image. It's talking about something deeper. It's talking about our actual personhood. So what does it mean to be a person? I took a couple of philosophy classes at ETB when I went there, and this was my favorite question to try to unpack. Our philosophy professor, he said, what does it mean to be a person? And everybody starts throwing out things like, well, you've got a head, you've got 2 arms, you've got 2 legs. And he's like, well, that chair has 2 legs. Is it a human? I was like, oh, I see where you're going here. He was just having fun, with the young college students. But he's getting to something very real, that if, for instance, a veteran fights for me in battle and he loses his legs, he's not less of a person than I am, right? He's still wholly a person. So it's something more than that. This image that we've picked up from God that he's implanted in us is something more than just our physical self. It's an image. We're made in that image. So then we get to this question of what is God's image? That's what matters, right? If what God has implanted in us is his image, then what is his image? I wrote down some things, and I'll read it to you. I'm not going to give an exhaustive picture of what he is, but let's scratch the surface. God is perfection. God is light. God is a rock. God is a wellspring. God is a consuming fire. God is righteousness. He's the God of justice, but also he's the God of mercy. God is a patient father waiting for his children to return home. But also God is a ferocious mother bear fighting for her cubs. God is kindness. God is self-control. God is faithfulness. God is gentleness. God is peace. God is joy. God is goodness. And God is love. I could go on about his image, because it is vast and it is beautiful. But that gives us the picture, right? That's the image of God. It's not something physical. It's not to say that my face looks kind of like God's face. It's to say that my personhood, my character, my very being is a reflection, is an image of who God is. And who God is love and goodness and peace and joy and perfection. So I got the great honor of doing a worship discipleship school. I never thought I'd be able to do it just didn't think I was going to have the extra money to do it, but God really just worked out a way for me to do this. There's a worship discipleship school based out of Atlanta that's called 10,000 Fathers, and it's a year and a half. It's pretty intensive. You have to go to Atlanta 3 times. It costs money and stuff, but God really worked out a way for me to be able to do it, and some really, really great truths were communicated to me. I had some great realizations about so many different things in my life, and how to disciple, and how to be a father of ministry, and how to be a father of worship, and how to communicate deep truths. And I'll never forget one of the, we throw this term around a lot in 10,000 Fathers Worship School, kairos. It's a time in Greek. So for the Greeks, if they were to say kairos, they would say something like, it's the moment. And so for our sake of understanding, a kairos moment is like whenever everything comes together. It's like all these things are happening, and you've probably experienced these moments in your life where it just clicks, and you're like, oh, I understand why this was happening, and why this was happening, and why that didn't happen, and why this seemed so awful, but this thing seemed good, and just all together, that moment when it all makes sense about a situation. The Greeks would call that a kairos moment. So I had a really great kairos moment whenever I was in track 2 of 10,000 Fathers. So this is the second time I went to Atlanta, and I'll be there for a week. So I'll be away from my wife for a week, which was the longest stint I'd ever been away from her. And I'm a bit of a needy person, so I would find myself really, really lonely in that little twin-size bed by myself. But the last day of 10,000 Fathers track 2, well, the last day of every track, there's always about 3 hours of what we just call ministry time. So it's really just an intensive time where we're trying to unpack what God's been speaking to us and respond to that. Because what does it mean for God to speak to you, for him to communicate some great truth to you, if all you do is just pass one ear and not the other, and you never respond to it, right? So we have some of our other students just leading worship. We're in Aaron Key's basement, which is bigger than my house. And I'll never forget, I heard God say, ask me. And so I knew exactly what he meant. You see, my wife and I have been married for almost 8 years now, and we have not been trying to do any birth control for over 7 years. And so we've yearned for our family, and we've always wanted to adopt, but also we'd love to have our own children too. And it was in that moment where God said, ask me, that I was like, oh my goodness, I've never asked because I've been so afraid that you'd say no or whatever. So I got down on my knees, and before I could even utter, any phrase, the waterworks were everywhere. And so I had to just lay prostrate and bury my face in the rug that everybody was walking on, just to not be so loud to be distracting to other people. And I asked God for my daughter. I asked God for my family to be made whole. And it was in that moment, that wasn't the kairos moment yet. The kairos, where it all made sense, was the realization. And I was stunned. I was just white. I was just, oh my goodness. I realized in that moment that the reason that that even from a young age, I wanted to have my wife. And I wanted to love my children. I wanted to provide for them. I want to show my daughters that the idea of that you have to look a certain way and you have to make yourself available to men is a lie, that men should yearn and seek after you, and they should court you. And I want to break through the lies where men think that we can use women for our own satisfaction. I want to teach children that I want my family to be whole, and I want us to be kingdom-minded. I've yearned for that. And I realized in that moment, the reason why I was yearning for my family to be together, is because God yearns for his family to be together. It's a desire. It was his desire first that he implanted into me. is a bit of his image. It was a bit of his image that he implanted in me. And I realized that the reason that I wanted those things so much is because he wants them so much. And so I ensued to cry even harder because I was just like, God, you're good. You're so, so good. And so it leads me to the first point about our image and as it relates to God. And that is this: the good things about your character and your personalities are reflections of our God and Creator. You think about it. Everything that's good in you, if you find it easy to serve people and you put yourself in situations where you do that often, that's because that's who God is. God sent his son Jesus not to come and lord over people, but to be a servant, right? He came to serve and not be served, right? So if you find it easy and you find a yearning inside of yourself to serve people in this way or that way, that is God's image inside of you swelling up and showing itself to the world. If you find yourself wanting to make provision for people financially, or providing resource for people who are less fortunate than you, that's our God. He's a provider. That's him coming out in you. If you find yourself wanting to sacrifice, if you find yourself joyful, if you find it easy to forgive and hard to hold on to things, you see what I'm saying? You see, there's a trend here. These good things about us, they're reflections of God. They're not something that we can attribute to our own goodness or something that we've worked to achieve. They're seeds that God planted in us long, long ago. And we have to water those. I realized that I want my family together because God wants his family together. And so we have to realize that every good thing about our character, every good thing about our personality, it's just a reflection of God. It's a part of his image coming out in us. This one might be a little bit more troubling to you. Point 2. The bad things about your character and personality are reflections of our God and Creator. You see, everything is a reflection of our God's image. Now, granted, there are plenty of things that we twist. There are plenty of things that we muddy down. You see, but whenever God created us, he did not mess up. I don't know if you know this, but God doesn't mess up. Whenever God creates things, they are good, period. You're good. God created you good. And so if there's parts of you that seem to be out of line with God or his image or his character or his personality, it's not because he didn't implant it there. It's because the enemy has planted things in your life and you've allowed those things to twist the very image of God that is trying to reflect to a world around you. I'll give you some examples. So for me, and if you don't know, I don't know how things were whenever you were growing up. I know that there's all different ages in this house today, but for me, I grew up in the digital age. Whenever I was 13 years old, I had a computer with internet in my room. That was the house internet. It was in my room. And so I remember when I was 10 years old, a guy who was 2 or 3 years older than me that I hung out with a lot, he introduced me to a very evil thing known as porn. And that had its grips on me for years and years. And I already dealt with this issue of just shame, and I'll dive into that here in a second. But I remember feeling just over and over and over, like, what is wrong with me? Like, I'm a Christian. I love God. Why am I doing this? I'm 16. I just committed my life to ministry. What am I doing? I love God. What's wrong with me? Like, Not like, why am I doing this bad thing? It's like, what is wrong with me? There's something wrong with my person. And I look back on that bondage in my life that was only freed through intimacy with God. If you want an answer, if you have an issue, I hate to, for lack of better words, in the Western sense, be the bearer of bad news. There's not an A, B plus C equals whatever to how to fix your life. Like if you have issues, you need intimacy with Jesus. That's where everything flows from. If you need peace, if you have trouble with your bitterness, if you find yourself being angry or you're depressed or you just whatever, I mean, there's some things that can help you with behavior modification, but if you want a cure, you have to go to the source. You have to spend time with Jesus, and that's how I broke my chains of addiction and lust. But I look back on that, and even that lust, even that addiction was just a twisted image of God. You see, even God himself has put himself in a place where he yearns for our intimacy. If that doesn't change your life, I don't know what will. God yearns for your intimacy. He gave his son. He gave everything just so that the veil could be torn and you could have access to him, so that you could know him intimately. He says, I don't just want to be your master and your king. I want to be your friend. I want to be closer than your closest friend, closer than your closest lover. I want to be your everything. You see, I look back on that and I see that yearning that I was trying to fulfill for intimacy with this addiction, this lust, it was just twisted. It was a good thing that God implanted into me, that the enemy threw bad seeds and introduced a very evil vice into my life, and it held me captive. But the seed itself was good. The plant that God was trying to grow for yearning for intimacy with him was pure. It was right. And how evil the enemy is that he would turn something that pure into something that evil and depraved. So another thing, actually, let me read this other verse. So this is Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 24. I know that this parable is specifically talking about the nature of the kingdom of God, but it really makes sense with what we're talking about here. Verse 24, Matthew chapter 13, it says this: He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who has sowed good seed in his field, but while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed seeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore again, then the weeds appeared also, and the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, An enemy has done this. So the servant said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? That's not important for this, what we're getting at here, but he ends with this, that an enemy has done this. So in this parable, a master has had his servants go out and spread some seed of wheat. And as soon as darkness fell, his enemy came and he sowed bad seeds. And so as those seeds grew, as that wheat was growing, also some weeds began to grow. And the servants are like, Master, did you not sow good seeds? You ever find yourself asking God that question? Are you sure you knew what you were doing here? And then in God's response is about the enemy. It's, yeah, I knew what I was doing. I planted good seeds. But as soon as darkness fell, the enemy came and he planted bad seeds. Seeds that were designed to choke the life out of the good ones. I want to tell you a little bit more about my shame. This is my track 3 of 10,000 Fathers, and we did a guided prayer time with the purpose of trying to figure out the root of of some of our issues. So one of my main issues is that I dealt with shame, and so everybody was trying to kind of figure out, okay, what's the root of this thing so I can have some power over it, so I can experience some freedom, so I can be productive for the kingdom. And I'll say it very quickly. I went through about 30 minutes of guided prayer, just trying to really pinpoint what was going on, where was the source of this, and I have some very vivid memories of whenever I was young. I kind of have some blank spaces, but my very first memory is traumatic. I was molested as a little child, and that's the very first memory I have. But it wasn't that memory. It was another memory in that very same house. We were living with my grandparents at the time. And I see myself. I see this baby who's probably a year and a half, and he's just crying, just weeping, just going crazy, just yelling at the screen door. And those screen doors, they have that little metal piece at the bottom. And I can see that baby, and their head's just barely over that. Just can barely see it, maybe up to the chin. And banging on that door, and I just have this overwhelming feeling of everybody has left me. And it's such a crazy thought, because it's a more complex thought than even a year and a half-year-old could experience. But when I look back on that, when I used to think back on it, I used to remember thinking to myself, they've left me because something's wrong with me. A 1.5-year-old can't think that. But a 25-year-old can when he looks back on a memory. I remember thinking that when I look back on those memories. And so I get to that memory, and the woman who's leading me in this prayer, trying to help me just really divide the truth of a memory, she says, do you have that picture? Do you have that picture in your head? And my eyes are closed. And I said, I see it. And I can't see her. I'm just so focused on this memory that I don't even know where she is. And she comes right over my head, and she goes, I was like, oh my gosh. She scared me. And she said, now where's Jesus? And I see him. He's just right there with me. And then she just says, in Jesus' name, show us the rest of the memory. And I did. For the first time in my whole life, I saw the rest of the memory. My mom came. She was just asleep. She came and picked me up, and that's where my memory ended. I wasn't there alone. Nobody had left me. Even if they had gone outside to do yard work, it wouldn't have been like they left me. But my mom was even in the house, and the rest of that memory is that my mom picks me up, and she comforts me. She's Jesus to me. And I will tell you that I've never been more mad in my life. Because I was in there with another guy, and he was sharing a story too, and it was kind of similar. And I've never been more mad. I just wanted to hit something. I just wanted to break things, because I realized in that moment that our enemy, he will go so far as to plant evil seeds in little babies. Helpless little babies. He will plant the most evil, unpure, untrue lies and weeds to choke out the goodness that God has planted into us. He'll do that even to babies. Not like he does that sometimes. That's how he works. That's what his word says here. That's what God's word says here, is that he threw out good seed, and as soon as night came, the enemy snuck in like the no good, rotten scoundrel that he is, and he sprinkled some evil seeds. And those seeds, they twist the image of God. But the truth is this, is there's two forces always fighting for you. There's good, it's God, and there's evil, and that's our enemy. But the greater truth is that those forces are not equal. We don't live in a dualistic truth. God is infinitely more powerful. darkness is a slave to the light. So we have to let what God has planted in our life and is actively trying to grow be the measure of who we are. See, there's another thing about me. My aunt used to always say, you can you could argue with the wall. And I remember my cousin always saying that to me. So I remember from being young thinking that, man, I just have this thing in me. I like to argue. And as I've gotten older, I realized it's not that I like to argue. I just want for truth to prevail. And as I've read the Word, I realized that Jesus is the truth. And so for me to pursue truth is to pursue Jesus. You see, even that thing that God has put in me, that the enemy wants me, has tried to twist in me. There's been very many times in my life when I was a younger man where I just wanted to argue with someone and win. That's prideful. That's a twisted, perverted seed that the enemy has planted in my life to try to twist this real good seed that God planted in me that was pursue truth. You see, the enemy does that. But we have to do this. We have to let what God has planted in our life be the measure of who we are, not what the enemy has come in afterwards. So the third point is this, and we're almost done. You are an image of a perfect God. So pick up your mantle and be who you are. I'm going to explain that last part in a second. You see, you don't have the right to say, well, I'm just a contrary person, or I'm just, I just don't like having fun, or joyful things, they just don't make me feel good, or I just can't get over this bitterness, or I don't like being around people, or as a follower of Christ, as someone who's been covered by the blood, and even your very nature that was put in you first and foremost is in complete opposition to that. You don't have that crutch to lean on except for the crutch that the enemy has put in your life. And that's not a good crutch. You see, you don't have the right to just say that I'm this way unless it is in line with the image of God. Does that make sense? You don't have the right to say, well, I'm just an angry person. Is God just angry? The Word says he's slow to anger. And we're great beneficiaries of that truth. Well, it's just hard for me to find joy. Or I'm just not a very happy person. God is joy. I'm just not a very loving person. God is love. See, you don't have any ground to stand on except for the ground that says, I'm made in the image of God. God's not addicted to things. God's not bitter. Lucky for us. So I'm not trying to like point a finger of blame on you. What I'm saying is stop giving yourself the liberty. Stop giving yourself a crutch, because that crutch was handed to you by the enemy himself. God is saying, I made you in my image and I want you to be that. And you have every power through the Spirit to do it. I want to tell you this, that the enemy doesn't have any claim on who you are because he didn't have anything to do with creating you. He's just a shyster who came in afterwards and tried to mix things up. And he's good at it. All he's done is sow seeds of lies and discord. I want to read two more verses to you and we're almost done. Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, it says this. It's Jesus talking about Peter. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. This is Simon, who is also called Peter. His name is Petros, which literally means little rock or small boulder. There's another verse, Matthew chapter 21, verse 42. Jesus said to them, this is Jesus referencing a prophecy in Psalm chapter 118. Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. You see, Jesus, I've shared this in another message. Jesus shared something with Peter, and he shares it with us too. You see, Jesus is saying that I am that rock that the builders rejected, and I'm calling Peter the little rock. I'm sharing my covenant identity with you, is what he's saying. I love this. I love this about the Bible because the themes just stay true. God created us in his image in chapter 1. And all the way here in the Gospels, we still see this theme just reverberating true. It's reverberating true that Jesus is the rock. And Peter is the rock, just a man, just a regular man, just like you and I. Peter's no greater, no less than you and I. The same spirit that was in him is in me. You see, there's this continued shared image, and with this continued shared image, there is a mantle that Jesus means to pass off. He did that. He did that with the disciples, right? He went on. The Spirit came. And he said, you're my foundation now. I'm going to build my church on you. Here's the mantle of building my church. You see, God didn't just create us in his image because he likes looking at himself. He created us in his image because we have purpose. He wants to pass on his mantle to us. He wants to pass on his work for his kingdom to us. And so I want to share something with you. So today we're celebrating our veterans, but also there's something that breaks my heart that so often goes completely unnoticed or unmentioned in our churches. And today is Orphan Sunday. Very quickly, I have an image. It's going to be up here. So, yeah, I'll explain this to you. So those blue numbers, that's how many waiting children are in each state. So in Louisiana, there is 1,089 waiting children. What I mean by waiting children, those are children whose rights have been relinquished, as in their parents have said they don't want them, or they're orphans. Now, this is just waiting children. There's plenty of other children in the foster care system, but there is almost 1,100 children in our state that are actively, literally just waiting for somebody to adopt them. You see how many churches there are in our state? Almost 8,000. And that number at the top right there is a national number because there's about 120,000 waiting children. Granted, these are not just, that's not even including children that are just in crisis or that are in the foster care system. That is just waiting children. There's about 120,000 waiting children in our country, and there's over 300,000 churches in our country. So what that number that little picture at the top is telling you is that if one out of every 3 churches, just one, would adopt a child, all these children who are teenagers or 10 years old and know that nobody wants them, they would all have a family. See, this is a practical mantle. You see, we live in a culture where we look to our government to take on this problem of, all these orphans and all these children who are fatherless. We look to them for them to make them wards of the state. But it's supposed to have always been our purpose as the church to take care of those that can't take care of themselves, right? True religion. Taking care of the orphans. You see, this is an image of God, a part of his mantle that he's meaning to hand off to us, that we should pick up, that we shouldn't look to our government to handle for us. You see, I know I'm going a little long, but you see, whenever we get to heaven, whenever we stand before a holy God, I guarantee you, brothers and sisters, and hear my heart, I guarantee you God is not going to ask you, did you achieve the American dream? Did you have a good nuclear family? But you better bet that God is going to ask you, did you take care of widows and orphans? Because that's the mantle I tried to pass off to you. Were you able to give money to organizations that help with this? Were you able to even take children in your home, but you just didn't? Those are going to be questions that God asks us, because that's the nearest thing to God's heart, is taking care of those that can't take care of themselves. This is just an example. It's always been the church's responsibility to carry on the mantle of Jesus Christ. So I put that before you this morning. Brothers and sisters, recognize that you are an image of a perfect God. So pick up your mantle and just be who you are. Don't let the excuses that the enemy tries to put in your head and has planted so long ago define you. Your identity is wholly and completely governed by who God has created you to be. Let's pray.